Europe, the cradle of empires and revolutions, now stood on the edge of destruction. The year was 1939. The air was thick with fear, ambition, and deceit. Across the continent, dictators rose like shadows stretching over the dying light of peace. At the heart of it all was Adolf Hitler, a man whose hunger for power would plunge the world into its deadliest war. After rebuilding Germany's military and defying the Treaty of Versailles, he set his eyes on Poland, a nation standing between his dream of domination and the reality of resistance. Hitler's voice echoed across Germany, filled with promises of unity and revenge. The people cheered, blinded by pride and propaganda, but behind the loud applause, a storm was forming, one that would soon engulf all of Europe. Sound design cue marching boots, rumbling tanks, faint sirens. On the 1st of September, 1939, as the first rays of dawn broke through the clouds, the world changed forever. German panzer divisions rolled across the Polish border, their engines roaring like thunder. The skies above were darkened by swarms of Luftwaffe bombers, raining fire upon cities and villages alike. In a matter of days, Poland's defenses crumbled. Civilians fled in terror as the German blitzkrieg, lightning war, struck with terrifying speed and precision. But Hitler's aggression did not go unanswered. 2 days later, on September 3rd, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The world was once again at war. World War II had begun. Narration solemn tone. As Europe erupted into chaos, nations were forced to choose sides. Some allied with Germany out of fear or ideology, Italy under Mussolini, Hungary, and others seeking their own slice of power. Others stood defiant: Britain, France, and soon, nations across the world would join them in the struggle for survival. The ordinary people, however, had no choice. Families were torn apart, children hid in basements, and soldiers marched toward battlefields they might never return from. In Berlin, Hitler celebrated the swift victory in Poland, but his eyes were already set elsewhere, on the West. For him, Poland was only the beginning. Europe was to burn, and from its ashes, he dreamed of a new order. The year was 1940. Europe trembled under the weight of a storm that refused to die. Poland had fallen, and Hitler's army stood poised along the borders of Western Europe. The world waited, holding its breath, wondering where the next blow would land. Then, in the cold dawn of May 10, 1940, the German war machine struck again, swift, ruthless, unstoppable. The blitzkrieg moved west, sound design roaring engines, bombing sirens, tank treads. Germany invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg in a coordinated assault that stunned Allied commanders. Columns of tanks ripped through forests and fields, while the Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Allied forces rushed forward to defend Belgium, unaware that the Germans had a deadly trick waiting. While the Allies fought in the north, German armored divisions moved secretly through the Ardennes, forest, a region thought impassable for tanks. Within days, they broke through at Sedan, splitting the Allied armies in two. The trap had been sprung. France, proud and historic, found itself cornered and crumbling under the speed of the German advance. Narration calm, dramatic pause. In the streets of Paris, sirens wailed as the Luftwaffe bombed cities and bridges. Refugees flooded the roads, millions of men, women, and children, carrying whatever they could, fleeing south from the approaching storm. British and French troops fought bravely, but the enemy was everywhere. At Dunkirk, hundreds of thousands of soldiers were trapped against the sea, surrounded by German forces, closing in like a tightening noose. Then came one of the most remarkable moments of the war. Operation Dynamo. Under constant attack, a desperate evacuation began. From May 26 to June 4, 1940, over 330,000 Allied soldiers were rescued by a fleet of naval ships, fishing boats, and civilian vessels, the little ships of Dunkirk. Though it was a retreat, it was also a miracle, a glimmer of hope in Europe's darkest hour. Summer 1940. France had fallen. Europe lay in ruins under the boots of Hitler's armies. Only one nation now stood between Nazi domination and total victory: Great Britain. Across the English Channel, the German war machine prepared for its next conquest. Hitler called it Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. But before German troops could set foot on British soil, they needed control of the skies. And thus began one of the most legendary battles in history, the Battle of Britain. Sound design: aircraft engines roaring, anti-aircraft guns firing, faint radio chatter. The German Luftwaffe, confident from its victories in Poland and France, launched a massive air campaign against Britain in July 1940. Wave after wave of bombers and fighters streaked across the sky, their engines howling as they dropped bombs over military bases, airfields, and ports. But waiting for them high above, the clouds were the pilots of the Royal Air Force, the RAF. They were young, often barely in their 20s, from Britain, Canada, Poland, and many other nations. Their mission: defend the skies at any cost. Voice intensifies determined tone. Every day, fierce dogfights erupted across the blue summer skies. The British Spitfires and Hurricanes faced off against the powerful German Messerschmitts. For hours, they twisted and dived through smoke and fire, turning the skies into deadly battlegrounds. Londoners watched from below, shielding their children as burning aircraft plummeted to the ground. The war had come to the very heart of Britain. The Luftwaffe believed Britain would fall within weeks. But they underestimated one thing: the courage and resilience of the British people. When bombs rained down on cities during what came to be called the Blitz, civilians refused to break. Night after night, Londoners took shelter in underground stations, singing, praying, and vowing to survive. Above ground, flames lit the night sky, but the British spirit burned brighter. Music softens noble, heroic tone. By September 1940, the tide began to turn. The RAF, though outnumbered, fought with unmatched bravery and skill. Using radar technology, a new and secret weapon, they detected enemy aircraft before they arrived. Slowly, the Luftwaffe began to falter. Hitler, frustrated by the losses, postponed his invasion plans. For the first time, his seemingly unstoppable war machine had been halted. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill summed it up best in his immortal words: "Was the dawn of June 22, 1941. As the sun rose over the vast plains of Eastern Europe, a monstrous roar echoed across the horizon. The ground trembled under the weight of thousands of tanks, trucks, and marching soldiers. The largest invasion in human history had begun. Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's armies, nearly 4 million men, invaded the Soviet Union, breaking the non-aggression pact he had signed with Joseph Stalin just 2 years earlier. This was no ordinary campaign. This was a war of annihilation, crusade against communism, and for Hitler, quest for Lebensraum, or living space, for his empire. Sound design: engines roaring, artillery fire, distant shouting in German and Russian. German forces struck in 3 massive directions: Army Group North, toward Leningrad; Army Group Center, toward Moscow; Army Group South, toward Ukraine and the oil fields beyond. The Red Army was caught by surprise. In the opening weeks, the Wehrmacht advanced at lightning speed, capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and swallowing entire cities. German tanks cut through the vast fields like knives through paper, while the Luftwaffe dominated the skies, destroying Soviet aircraft before they could even take off. Villages burned, civilians fled in panic, and entire Soviet divisions vanished in the chaos. Voice softens grave tone, but the victory Hitler dreamed of was an illusion. The deeper his armies pushed into the Soviet Union, the longer their supply lines stretched. The land was vast, the roads were poor, and resistance grew fiercer every day. Soviet soldiers, often ill-equipped and outgunned, fought with unimaginable determination. For them, this was not just a war, it was survival. Behind them stood Stalin, ordering that no one retreat, no matter the cost. Not one step back, he commanded. And then, there was the Russian winter. Brutal, merciless, and unlike anything the Germans had faced before. As temperatures dropped to 40 C, engines froze, weapons jammed, and frostbite claimed more soldiers than bullets. Music builds tragic orchestral theme. By December 1941, the German advance had reached the outskirts of Moscow. Victory seemed within reach, but the Soviet Union did not break. Fresh reinforcements, drawn from the east, counterattacked with fury. For the first time, the German army was forced to retreat. Hitler had underestimated both the land and its people. The blitzkrieg, once unstoppable, had met its match in the frozen steppes of Russia. Winter of 1942. The Eastern Front had become a graveyard. For every mile of ground gained, tens of thousands died. The dream of Hitler's lightning victory had frozen in the snows of Russia. Now, what began as an invasion had become a war of survival, of firestorms stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. German soldiers shivered in torn uniforms, starving, frostbitten, and surrounded by enemies they could not see. Soviet resistance grew stronger every day. Behind every village, every ruined city, stood men and women ready to fight, even if it meant their death. Sound design, wind howling, distant artillery, echo of explosions. Hitler refused to retreat. His generals begged for withdrawal, but he ordered them to hold the line, to fight to the last bullet. He believed willpower could conquer nature itself, but nature had already chosen its side. The vast fields turned into swamps of mud and blood. Tanks sank. Horses froze mid-step. Villages once filled with life became smoldering shells, their people gone or buried beneath the snow. And amid this frozen nightmare rose one of the most brutal battles in human history. Stalingrad. Voice intensifies tense, cinematic tone. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched a new offensive toward the Volga River, targeting the city that bore Stalin's name. He vowed to crush it, to humiliate the Soviet leader, and to seize the oil-rich lands beyond. German bombers reduced Stalingrad to rubble, turning it into a maze of ruins. But what Hitler didn't expect was that the destruction would make the city easier to defend. The Soviet soldiers fought from every street, every basement, every shattered wall. They called it Rattenkrieg. The rat were fighting house to house, room to room. German snipers waited in the shadows. Soviet grenades flew through broken windows. Death was everywhere, in the air, in the smoke, in the silence between explosions. Music lowers grim, emotional tone. Then, in November 1942, the Soviets struck back. Operation Uranus, a massive counter-offensive, encircled the entire German 6th Army. Over 300,000 German troops were trapped inside the city, surrounded by the Red Army and cut off from supplies. The cold deepened. Food ran out. Men starved, froze, and fought with desperation. Still, Hitler demanded they fight to the end. By February 1943, the once mighty 6th Army surrendered. Stalingrad was in ruins, but the Soviet flag rose above the ashes. The unthinkable had happened. Nazi Germany had suffered its first great defeat. While Europe froze beneath the fires of war, another battle raged far to the south, across the endless dunes of North Africa. Here, under the blazing sun, tanks clashed like steel beasts in a struggle for control of the Mediterranean. This was a different kind of war, fought not in cities or forests, but in the burning deserts of Libya and Egypt. At the heart of it all stood two legendary commanders, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the German Desert Fox, and General Bernard Montgomery, the determined British leader who vowed to stop him. Sound design, roaring engines, wind over sand, distant explosions. When Italy joined the Axis in 1940, Mussolini dreamed of conquering North Africa, but his poorly equipped troops were soon driven back by British forces. Hitler, unwilling to see his ally defeated, sent reinforcements, the Afrika Corps, commanded by Rommel. Rommel quickly turned the tide. Using speed, deception, and bold tactics, he became a master of desert warfare. His tanks struck from unexpected directions, vanishing into the sands before the enemy could react. To his soldiers, he was a hero. To the Allies, a ghost. By 1942, the Afrika Corps had pushed deep into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal, a lifeline of the British Empire. If Rommel captured it, the Axis would control access to the Middle East and its vital oil. Voice intensifies tense, dramatic tone. But the British were not done. Under General Montgomery, they regrouped, reinforced, and prepared for one decisive stand. That stand came at El Alamein, a small railway town on the edge of the desert. In October 1942, the desert erupted. Thousands of guns roared in unison. Tanks advanced across minefields and dunes, their treads cutting through fire and smoke. Rommel fought fiercely, but this time, the British held firm. After 12 days of relentless combat, the Afrika Korps began to retreat. Churchill later declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." It was the turning point in North Africa. Music softens hopeful reflective tone. By May 1943, the last Axis forces in Tunisia surrendered. The Desert War was over. North Africa was free. For the first time since the war began, the Allies had gained the upper hand. And now, they had a new plan to strike at the soft underbelly of Hitler's Europe. The invasion of Italy was next. Summer of 1943. The deserts of North Africa had fallen silent. The Axis armies were in retreat, and for the first time, the Allies looked toward Europe with confidence. Their next target, Italy, the heart of Mussolini's fascist empire and Hitler's most vulnerable ally. From the airfields of North Africa, Allied bombers now thundered across the Mediterranean, striking at Italy's ports and factories. Meanwhile, an invasion force gathered hundreds of ships and thousands of men, ready to storm the soft underbelly of Axis Europe. Sound design: roaring waves, planes overhead, distant explosions. On July 10, 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily. British, American, and Canadian troops poured onto the beaches under heavy fire. The fighting was brutal, but within weeks, the island was theirs. The fall of Sicily shook the foundations of Mussolini's regime. His people had lost faith. His generals had lost hope. On July 25, Mussolini was arrested by his own government. For Italy, the dictator's dream of empire had collapsed into dust. But Hitler refused to let his ally go. As the Allies prepared to invade mainland Italy, German forces moved swiftly to seize control. In the chaos that followed, Hitler rescued Mussolini in a daring commando raid and placed him in charge of a puppet government in the north, the so-called Italian Social Republic. Italy was now a nation divided, and the war was far from over. Voice intensifies dramatic battle tone. On September 3, 1943, the Allies invaded the mainland at Salerno and Calabria. The beaches turned into killing grounds. German artillery pounded the shorelines, and snipers waited in the hills. Every inch of ground was earned with blood. Despite fierce resistance, the Allies pushed north. Cities like Naples, Cassino, and Anzio became symbols of sacrifice, where soldiers fought for months just to gain a few miles. At Monte Cassino, one of Italy's most sacred monasteries was reduced to rubble in the crossfire. The campaign was slow, brutal, and costly. Italy's steep mountains and narrow roads made it the perfect defensive battlefield for the Germans. But the Allies would not stop. Music softens reflective, noble tone. By the spring of 1944, Rome was finally liberated. The streets filled with joy as Allied troops marched through the Eternal City. For Italy, the nightmare of fascism was ending. But even as bells rang in Rome, the war's greatest gamble was about to unfold elsewhere. Across the English Channel, in the fields of Normandy, the invasion that would decide the fate of the world was near. By 1944, the tide of war had finally turned. The Allies stood ready to strike the final blow against Nazi Germany. For 5 long years, Europe had suffered under occupation and fear. But now, liberation was coming. The mission had a single name that would echo through history: D-Day. Across the English coast, an army of hope was gathering. More than 150,000 soldiers, thousands of ships, and countless aircraft waited for the signal to begin the greatest amphibious invasion ever attempted. Their target, the heavily fortified beaches of Normandy, France. Sound design: rolling waves, engines roaring, faint thunder of artillery in the distance. For months, Allied leaders Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Roosevelt planned every detail. Deception operations misled the Germans into thinking the attack would come at Calais, far from Normandy. Meanwhile, resistance fighters inside France sabotaged rail lines, bridges, and communication centers, ready to rise when the invasion began. On the night of June 5, 1944. Paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions dropped behind enemy lines. They landed in darkness, scattered and confused, but determined to seize bridges and roads before dawn. Their courage paved the way for what came next. Voice intensifies, cinematic tone. At 6:30 a.m., June 6, 1944, the invasion began. Five beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword erupted in chaos. The sea churned with bullets and fire. Landing craft opened to a storm of machine gun fire. Men leapt into the cold surf, clutching rifles and gasping for breath as shells exploded around them. At Omaha Beach, the resistance was fierce. Cliffs lined with German bunkers unleashed hell on the Americans below. Bodies lay strewn across the sand, but still, they pushed forward. By sheer determination and sacrifice, they broke through the German defenses. By nightfall, the Allies had secured a fragile foothold in Europe once more. Music softens reverent tone. Behind them lay thousands of dead and wounded, but their courage had opened the door to freedom. From the beaches of Normandy, Allied forces began their long march east through the hedgerows of France, the streets of Paris, and eventually toward Germany itself. For Hitler, D-Day was the beginning of the end. His empire, once built on terror and conquest, was now crumbling beneath the weight of Allied unity and unstoppable resolve. Summer of 1944. The beaches of Normandy had been taken, but the battle for France had only begun. The Allies now faced a new challenge, pushing through the thick hedgerows and fortified towns of northern France, where the Germans fought fiercely to hold every inch of ground. The victory at D-Day was only the opening act. What followed was a brutal, grinding campaign that would decide the fate of Western Europe. The liberation of France. Sound-designed tank engines, gunfire echoing distant airstrikes. For weeks, the Allies advanced yard by yard through the countryside. German defenses were strong, their tanks the Panthers and Tigers deadly in ambush. But the Allied air superiority turned the tide. American Thunderbolts and British Typhoons ruled the skies, bombing roads, convoys, and strongholds. Meanwhile, the French resistance, who had fought in shadows for years, now rose openly against their occupiers. They cut supply lines, ambushed patrols, and guided Allied troops through unfamiliar terrain. The dream of freedom was alive again. Voice intensifies dramatic tone. By late July 1944, the Allies launched Operation Cobra, a massive breakout from the Normandy front. Columns of tanks smashed through German lines, finally shattering the stalemate. Within weeks, the German army was in full retreat. The road to Paris was open. As the Allies raced toward the French capital, the city itself erupted in revolt. On August 19th, the French resistance took up arms against the German garrison. Barricades rose on the boulevards, gunfire echoed through the narrow streets, and the tricolor flag once again waved over the city. Music builds triumphant orchestral theme. 5 days later, on August 25, 1944, Allied forces entered Paris. The people poured into the streets cheering, crying, embracing the soldiers who had come to free them. After 4 long years of occupation, the City of Light was free. General Charles de Gaulle marched proudly down the Champs-Élysées, declaring, "Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated." Church bells rang, flags fluttered from every window, and for the first time since 1939, hope returned to the hearts of millions. Voice softens reflective tone. But even in victory, the war was not over. As celebrations filled Paris, Hitler's armies were regrouping across the border. Ahead lay the forests of Belgium, the mountains of Germany, and battles still more terrible than before. The Allies had reclaimed France, but to end the war, they would have to strike into the very heart of the Reich. Winter, 1944. Europe lay frozen under a blanket of snow. The Allies believed the war was nearing its end. Germany was collapsing, its armies retreating, its cities in ruins. But in the silence of the Ardennes forest, Adolf Hitler was preparing one last, desperate strike, a gamble that could change everything. It would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's final major offensive on the Western Front. Sound design: howling wind, rumbling artillery, muffled marching boots. On December 16, 1944, before dawn, the forests of Belgium erupted in fire. Hundreds of German tanks and thousands of troops stormed through the mist, smashing into the unsuspecting Allied lines. The Americans were caught completely off guard. The German assault created a deep wedge in the Allied front, a bulge on the battle map, giving the battle its haunting name. Hitler's goal was bold: to split the Allied forces, recapture the port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies to negotiate. If he succeeded, it could buy Germany time, maybe even change the course of the war. Voice intensifies dramatic tone. American troops fought fiercely, but the weather turned against them. Thick fog grounded Allied aircraft, leaving the soldiers alone in the freezing forests. At Bastogne, surrounded and cut off, the 101st Airborne Division refused to surrender. When the Germans demanded their capitulation, U.S. General Anthony McAuliffe gave a one-word reply: nuts. That single word became a symbol of defiance. Despite the bitter cold, hunger, and overwhelming odds, the Americans held their ground. Sound cue: engines roaring, gunfire, wind screaming. Then, the skies cleared. The roar of Allied bombers and fighters filled the air once again. The tide turned swiftly. General George S. Patton, leading his Third Army, made an astonishing maneuver, turning north through the snow to relieve Bastogne. By January 1945, the German offensive had failed. Their tanks ran out of fuel, their men out of hope. What was meant to be Hitler's triumphant comeback became a disaster that bled the last strength from the Wehrmacht. Voice softens somber reflection. The Battle of the Bulge cost the Germans over 100,000 men, soldiers, and resources they could never replace. For the Allies, it was a harsh reminder that the enemy, though wounded, was still deadly. As the snow melted and the smoke cleared, one truth became clear: Germany had played its last card. The road to Berlin now lay open. By the dawn of 1945, the Nazi war machine was crumbling. The failed gamble at the Battle of the Bulge had drained Germany's last reserves. Its cities lay in ruins, skies filled with Allied bombers, and its people starving in the cold winter of defeat. Yet, inside his bunker beneath Berlin, Adolf Hitler refused to surrender. He barked orders to divisions that no longer existed, commanding phantom armies that could not save him. But the Allies from both East and West were closing in. The final push toward Berlin had begun. Sound designed distant artillery, tanks grinding forward, wind over rubble. From the West, American, British, and French forces surged across the Rhine River, shattering the last German defenses. Cities like Cologne and Frankfurt fell one after another under relentless assault. General Eisenhower's armies moved like a tidal wave, unstoppable, determined, and vengeful. From the east, the Red Army of the Soviet Union advanced with ferocious speed. Led by Marshal Zhukov, millions of Soviet soldiers fought their way through Poland and into Germany itself. Every village, every field, became a battlefield soaked in blood. For them, this was not just victory, it was retribution. Voice intensifies dramatic tone. By April 1945, Berlin was surrounded. The Allies in the West paused their advance, allowing the Soviets to take the capital. And so began one of the most brutal urban battles in history, the Battle of Berlin. Soviet artillery rained destruction upon the city. Tanks crushed through streets lined with rubble. Civilians hid in basements as flames devoured what was left of the Reich's capital. The once mighty city of Berlin had become a graveyard of Hitler's ambitions. Sound cue: echoing gunfire, crumbling walls, fading cries. Inside the Führerbunker, Hitler faced reality at last. His empire, once stretching across Europe, was reduced to a few square miles of rubble. His generals argued, his allies deserted him, and his people were dying by the thousands. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler took his own life, ending the tyranny that had plunged the world into chaos. Outside, Soviet soldiers raised the red flag over the Reichstag, signaling that the Third Reich had fallen. Voice softens reflective, emotional tone. Berlin lay in ruins. Germany was broken, but as the smoke cleared and the guns fell silent, the true cost of victory began to emerge. Tens of millions were dead, entire nations destroyed, and humanity, scarred forever by the flames of war, would never be the same again. The firestorm that had consumed Europe was finally dying, but the ashes it left behind would shape the world for generations. May 1945, the guns of Europe finally fell silent. After 6 long years of war, the firestorm that had consumed an entire continent was over. Hitler was dead. Berlin lay in ruins. The Third Reich had collapsed into dust. But victory did not bring celebration alone. It brought grief, reflection, and a haunting question: how could humanity fall so deep into darkness? Sound designed slow marching drums, distant bells, faint cheering crowds. On May 8, 1945, victory in Europe Day was declared. Across London, Paris, and New York, people filled the streets, waving flags, crying tears of joy. Soldiers embraced strangers. Church bells rang for hours. For the first time in years, the night sky over Europe was free from fire and fear. In London, Winston Churchill addressed the jubilant crowds, his voice steady yet heavy. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget for a moment the toil and efforts that lie ahead. Because beneath the surface of victory lay the staggering cost of survival. Voice somber, reflective tone. Europe was shattered. Cities reduced to skeletons of stone and smoke. Millions displaced, wandering rows, with nothing but hope in their hands. Entire families lost not just to bombs or bullets, but to something far darker. As Allied soldiers liberated concentration camps Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Dachau, the world finally saw the true horror of the Nazi regime. Mountains of shoes, piles of bones, children who had forgotten what sunlight looked like. The Holocaust had claimed the lives of 6 million Jews, along with millions of others the Nazis deemed undesirable. The victory of the Allies was now also a reckoning, vengeance not for nations, but for humanity itself. Sound cue: quiet wind, echoing footsteps, a single violin note. In the months that followed, the victors began to rebuild. At Nuremberg, Nazi leaders were brought to trial for their crimes. A new era of justice born from the ashes of destruction. For the first time in history, the world declared that war crimes would not go unpunished, and that peace must be built not on revenge, but on remembrance. The map of Europe was redrawn. Germany was divided. The Soviet Union and the Western Allies, once united against a common enemy, now stood face to face in suspicion. The seeds of a new conflict, the Cold War, were already being sown. The war was over, but the peace had only just begun. Europe, once the center of civilization, now lay in ruins. Cities that had glowed with life, Warsaw, Berlin, London, Stalingrad, were now mountains of rubble and silence. From the ashes of destruction, the world faced its greatest challenge yet: to rebuild, to forgive, and to rise again. This was not just the end of a war, it was the beginning of a new world. Sound design: quiet hammering, distant church bells, voices rebuilding cities. Across Europe, people returned to what was left of their homes. Women and men who had survived the unimaginable began to piece together their shattered lives. They rebuilt roads, homes, and schools from the debris of battle. Children, who had grown up under bombs and sirens, now learned in classrooms where walls were patched with hope. But peace was fragile. In the East, the Soviet Union extended its power across Eastern Europe, spreading communist influence from Poland to Romania, and from Czechoslovakia to Hungary. In the West, the United States and Britain sought to rebuild free democracies through the Marshall Plan, providing food, funds, and faith in a better future. The world had split not by war this time, but by ideology. Voice intensifies: firm, cinematic tone. In 1949, NATO was formed, a new alliance of Western nations united against Soviet power. In response, the East created the Warsaw Pact. The Cold War had begun, a silent struggle of spies, fear, and nuclear shadows. Yet amid the tension, new hope was born. The United Nations was founded in 1945, built on the ashes of the League of Nations, to prevent another global catastrophe. Its mission: to protect human rights, preserve peace, and remind the world of the cost of hate. At the same time, colonies in Asia and Africa began to rise against their imperial rulers, demanding freedom and self-rule. Empires fell, and new nations were born. A new global order was taking shape, not of kings and conquerors, but of people seeking equality and peace. Voice softens reflective tone. Germany, the land that once plunged the world into chaos, now stood divided east vs west, Soviet vs Allied. The Berlin Wall would come later, but already a new kind of battlefield had formed, one of politics, propaganda, and ideology. The lessons of war were carved into every scarred city and silent grave. Humanity had witnessed the depths of its own cruelty, but also the strength of its spirit. From the ruins, Europe was reborn, not perfect, not united, but alive, determined to ensure that the fires of hatred would never again engulf the world. The guns of World War II had fallen silent, but peace did not bring calm. From the ashes of Hitler's empire rose two new superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. They had fought side by side to destroy fascism, but now they would battle each other not with tanks and trenches, but with ideologies and influence. This was the birth of a new kind of war, one fought in shadows, speeches, and fear. The Cold War had begun. Sound design ticking clock, faint radio broadcasts, distant jet hums. In the devastated heart of Europe, the continent became a chessboard. The West, led by America, stood for democracy and capitalism. The East, under Joseph Stalin, spread communism behind what Winston Churchill called the Iron Curtain. Germany became the front line of this new conflict, divided into four zones: American, British, French, and Soviet. The once mighty nation was split between two worlds. In 1949, the divide became permanent. West Germany under the Allies, and East Germany under the Soviets. And deep in the heart of that division lay Berlin, torn apart by ideology. Voice intensifies dramatic, urgent tone. Across Eastern Europe, Stalin's grip tightened. Communist governments rose one by one, their people silenced under fear and propaganda. Meanwhile, the West responded with the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars to rebuild Europe's shattered economies and stop communism spread. For the first time, war was being fought not on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of nations. In 1948, Stalin made his first move, the Berlin blockade. He cut off all roads and railways into West Berlin, trying to starve the Allies out of the city. But the response was extraordinary. For almost a year, American and British planes flew thousands of missions, delivering food, medicine, and hope to the trapped city. This became known as the Berlin Airlift, a symbol of resistance and resilience. Sound cue airplane engines, cheering civilians, radio crackle. The skies above Berlin became a lifeline. Every day, Allied aircraft landed with supplies. Every night, the lights of hope shone brighter over a city refusing to surrender. In May 1949, Stalin finally gave up. His blockade had failed, but the message was clear. The Cold War had truly begun. Voice softens reflective tone. The alliances of war had dissolved into suspicion. In the same year, NATO was formed, a pact of Western nations united against Soviet aggression. The world now stood divided not by battle lines, but by beliefs. And behind it all, a silent terror began to rise. The race for the atomic bomb, the weapon that ended World War II, had now become the ultimate threat in this new age of tension. The year was 1949, only 4 years after the end of World War II. The world stood once again at the edge of fear. Not from armies or tanks this time, but from a single weapon powerful enough to erase entire cities. The atomic bomb, humanity's deadliest creation. It had ended one war, but now, it threatened to begin another. This was the dawn of the nuclear age, the moment when peace itself became a fragile illusion. Sound design Geiger counter clicks, radio static, distant explosions. When the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, the world witnessed the unimaginable. Mushroom clouds rose into the sky like ghosts of destruction. Cities vanished in seconds, and over 200,000 lives were lost. The message was clear: whoever controlled the atom controlled the world. For a brief moment, America held that power alone. But in August 1949, the balance shattered. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The monopoly was gone. Now, two superpowers held the power to destroy humanity. Voice intensifies cinematic tone. The race began not to conquer territory, but to master annihilation. Both sides built bombs faster, bigger, deadlier. In 1952, the US unveiled the hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima. A year later, the Soviets answered with their own. The skies filled with fear. Children practiced duck and cover drills in schools, hiding under desks that would never protect them. Cities built bomb shelters. Governments distributed pamphlets on how to survive the unthinkable. For the first time, humanity lived under a nuclear shadow. The fear that one wrong move, one push of a button, could end everything. Sound cue ticking clock, echoing radio news reports, heartbeat rhythm. And yet, amid the tension, something strange happened. The world did not fall into war. Instead, fear itself became the weapon, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. If one side launched its bombs, the other would respond, and both would be obliterated. Paradoxically, it was this shared terror that kept the peace. Behind closed doors, spies stole secrets, scientists raced for breakthroughs, and leaders played a game where every misstep could mean extinction. The Cold War was no longer cold, it was glowing. Voice softens reflective, emotional tone. But amid the fear, people still dreamed of peace. The same scientists who had built the bomb now warned of its horror. Writers, poets, and politicians spoke of a future where the atom could bring energy, not destruction. The world stood divided between fear and hope, between the darkness of power and the light of progress. The fires of World War II had faded, but a new kind of darkness had fallen across Europe. From the Baltic to the Balkans, nations, once free, now lived behind what Winston Churchill called an iron curtain. It was not made of steel or stone, but of fear, control, and silence. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, had turned Eastern Europe into a fortress of communism, and between East and West, a frozen line of hostility divided the world. Sound designed faint marching footsteps, typewriters clacking, echoing radio propaganda. In Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and East Germany, communist regimes rose under Moscow's watchful eye. Freedom of speech vanished. Elections were rigged. Secret police roamed the streets, silencing anyone who dared to question the state. The dream of liberation had turned into a nightmare of obedience. Life behind the Iron Curtain meant ration cards, endless queues, and constant fear. Neighbors whispered cautiously. Children learned to praise Stalin in school, and the world outside the free world became nothing more than a rumor. Voice intensifies dramatic tone. In response, the West strengthened its unity. 1949 saw the birth of NATO, a military alliance between the United States, Britain, France, and other Western nations. A promise that an attack on one would be an attack on all. Stalin countered with his own alliance, the Warsaw Pact, binding the Eastern Bloc in military solidarity. Europe had become two worlds, one draped in liberty, the other in control. The tension between them was no longer just political, it was personal, a war of ideals. The West offered freedom and prosperity. The East offered order and equality at the cost of everything else. Sound cue dramatic strings, distant radio broadcasts of opposing leaders. The propaganda machines worked day and night. Posters, films, and speeches painted the other side as the enemy. Children in East Berlin were taught that Americans were monsters. In the West, the Soviet Union was portrayed as a cage of tyranny. Even families were divided, especially in Berlin, the city at the heart of the Cold War. People risked their lives to cross from east to west, escaping communism for freedom. But soon, even that escape would be sealed shut. Voice softens reflective tone. The Iron Curtain wasn't just a line on a map, it was a scar across humanity, a reminder that victory in war had not brought unity, but division. From the rubble of one empire, two superpowers had emerged, each convinced that only they could shape the world's future. And so, as Europe rebuilt, it did so under two shadows. one of hope, and one of fear. By the early 1960s, Berlin had become the heart of a divided world, a city split between two ideologies, two systems, and two destinies. The East, ruled by the Soviets, preached equality but enforced obedience. The West, protected by the Allies, promised freedom but faced constant tension. And in the middle stood Berlin, the last open door between two worlds. Every night, thousands fled from East Berlin to the West. Teachers, engineers, families, even soldiers, all seeking freedom from the iron grip of communism. To the East German government, this exodus was a humiliation, and to Moscow, it was intolerable. Sound cue hammering engines, tense crowd murmurs. Then came the night of August 13, 1961. As the city slept, East German troops and workers moved under the cover of darkness. Barbed wire, concrete blocks, and soldiers with rifles. By morning, Berlin was sealed. A line of wire became a wall. A city became a prison. Families woke to find their streets cut in half, their loved ones trapped on the other side. Mothers called out to sons across the barrier, only to be drowned out by barking dogs and shouting guards. The Berlin Wall, the most infamous symbol of the Cold War, had been born. Voice cinematic tension. In the following days, the wall grew taller and stronger. Concrete slabs replaced barbed wire, watchtowers rose, and armed guards patrolled day and night. Anyone who tried to escape risked their life. Some succeeded, daring jumps from windows, tunnels dug beneath the wall, or stolen vehicles crashing through checkpoints. But many didn't. Their names became whispers, reminders of the price of freedom. For nearly 3 decades, Berlin became a living wound on Europe's heart, one side bright with opportunity, the other drowned in fear. From the air, you could see the divide, the shining lights of West Berlin, and the cold darkness of the East. Sound design echoes of radio static. GF's voice faintly heard. Ich bin ein Berliner. In 1963, U.S. President John F. Kennedy stood before the wall and declared, Ich bin ein Berliner. I am a Berliner. His words echoed across the world, a message of unity and defiance. But the wall stood firm, concrete proof that even peace could be built on separation. Behind the Iron Curtain, life continued under watchful eyes. Children grew up never knowing the other side. The wall was more than a border. It was a symbol of everything humanity had lost. Voice softens reflective tone. Yet, even as the years passed, whispers of rebellion grew. Songs, letters, secret meetings, small acts of courage that chipped away at the wall's shadow. Because no wall, no matter how tall, could truly divide the human spirit.